Hey, good morning. So today we are continuing our cell surface unit and we're looking at cell walls. So outside of the cell surface, pretty much right there where the cell surface is, there are many cells that have cell walls. So 5.4 cell walls. Now I'm going to start by emphasizing that all cells have cell membranes. I think a lot of times students make a trade-off and say, oh, well, if animal cells have cell membranes, then plant cells have cell walls. And yes, that's a true statement, but plant cells also have cell membranes. All cells have cell membranes. It's kind of just a phospholipid bilayer. It's kind of what makes the outside of the cell. So all cells have a cell membrane. Most cells, so when I say most, we're talking not just about plants, but also about fungi and most bacteria. In addition, most protists as well. So the eukaryotic cells, like humans, like animal cells, plant cells, fungi, and protists. Those are the four eukaryotic kingdoms. Plants, fungi, and most protists actually have cells as well. Bacteria have cells. So again, when we say most cells have cell walls, we're really talking about the major exception being animal cells. So it's not that plant cells are weird for having a cell wall. It's more that animal cells are weird for not having a cell wall. Most cells have cell walls. You kind of notice I did put a couple little corners in there, but generally I didn't draw it like a box. I think it's customary to draw these cell walls like boxes. And not saying that's not true. You can look at a plant cell under a microscope and see the box, but it doesn't have to be a square. It doesn't have to be a box. It doesn't have to be a square. Cell walls can have curves to them. They can have angles. They don't have to be right angles. So cell walls don't have to be a box. We talked about this a couple of units ago. We actually drew some pictures of cell walls. Cell walls are made of carbohydrates. So it's polysaccharides. Think of a lot of glucose, a lot of hexagons all linked together, and proteins. Different species, though, have different compositions. So again, we kind of talked about this as well last chapter, 2 chapters ago. We talked about penicillin and how penicillin works to break up the cell wall of bacteria, but it doesn't do the same thing against plants or plants or fungi. And the reason for that is that they all have slightly different compositions of the types of carbohydrates and proteins that make up their cell wall. Plants, for instance, have primarily cellulose and the protein pectin that make up their cell wall, whereas bacteria have peptidoglycine. which is kind of a combination of the carbohydrate with the peptid. So peptides kind of attached to it. So there's slightly different ways that they build their cell wall, or slightly different materials, but in general, they're all made out of carbohydrates and proteins. Fungus use chitin, CHITIN, which again is just another carbohydrate, just a slightly different linkage of all of those monosaccharide units. The cell wall serves as a support and structure for the cell. So think of the walls of a room. They're hard. They kind of keep the room well defined. They can also kind of hold the ceiling up. You kind of think of the same thing as a cell wall. Very importantly, if you remember, we did the egg lab. When you held the egg, you could squeeze it a little bit. And the membrane gave just a little bit. Went in, went out. And I kept saying, hey, this is probably what a cell membrane would feel like. Cell walls, not the same. Cell membrane will give a little bit. It's fluid. You can push it. Cell wall, very rigid. You're not going to be able to squeeze it much. Again, think of the walls of a room. If you push, they're just going to kind of stay there. Plants actually prefer a hypotonic environment. So one of the big advantages of having that cell wall is that when the water comes in, we're in a hypotonic environment. That means the solution that you're in is less concentrated than the inside of your cell. In that hypotonic environment, the water rushes in. For an animal cell, the animal cell is eventually going to get much, much larger and bigger, and it's going to pop, and the animal cell's dead, and that's not good. But plant cells actually prefer that hypotonic environment. The water rushes in, but the plant cell doesn't get any bigger. It's surrounded by a cell wall that kind of keeps it at a safe size. So the water's coming in, but it doesn't pop. What it does is it moves the water up against gravity by doing that. You guys remember that's actually kind of how penicillin works. Penicillin stops bacteria from making their cell wall. It inhibits the protein that makes your cell wall. And so now that cell, which normally thinks it's all right to be in a hypotonic environment because it has a cell wall, doesn't have a cell wall, and it gets too big and it pops through osmosis. So, really cool with how the real world is working with concepts we're learning. All right, final note here. Cell walls are porous, and these are filled with holes. So yeah, you got these long chains of carbohydrates kind of wrapped around the cell. That's virtually what the cell wall is, but it's not airtight. It's not packed so tightly that things can't get through. Things do get through. If you remember, we started talking about the cell membrane a couple days ago. The cell membrane is what we call selectively permeable, which means some things get through and other things don't get through. That's selectively or semi-permeable. Well, cell walls are not selectively permeable. Pretty much everything can go right through a cell wall. It doesn't stop a whole lot of solute particles. Not really its job. Again, its job is to provide structure and support for the cell. And the cell membrane can determine what gets in out of the cell. Pretty much everything can go right through the cell wall, though. Not entirely true, I guess. Something that doesn't generally go through cell walls is viruses. Viruses have a tough time going through cell walls a lot of times. So plants are not usually susceptible to the same viruses that we get. All right, well, there's our notes on the cell wall, and we'll see you back here next time.